Welcome to the Brothers in Crime podcast.
We are brothers.
We talk about true crime.
We don't take ourselves too seriously.
And you shouldn't either. To start this episode, Bob, we've had some loyal listeners who've been with us for a long time, and I thought it would be kind of nice to give some shout-outs to the folks who have left us reviews, particularly on Apple Podcasts, not because we think Apple's the greatest. I know you don't feel that way. But on Spotify, we can't see names or reviews or anything like that. But on Apple, we can see, people can kind of leave a username and some comments. So I thought maybe we could just thank some of the folks who've been with us for a long time and left reviews.
Yeah, absolutely. Like G-Shep94, who we seem to have gotten addicted right from the get-go. So, hey, hope you're loving the true crime crack that we're giving you.
That's right. And we also had, this was an interesting username. Oh, you might know me as Yogi Bear. Thanks for listening. These guys have been around since the beginning. And so if you have a moment, if you listen on Apple and leave us a review, it really does help in terms of putting our show in front of more folks. The more ratings and reviews we have, that's how that happens. So we really appreciate it. And hey, all of you probably know somebody else who listens to True Crime Podcasts, so tell your friends. Well, Bob, in the last episode, you brought up the fact that we often have covered cases where individuals have been either accused, charged, and convicted, imprisoned for crimes that they didn't commit, that somebody else committed. And these aren't people who got off on a technicality or because they had a fancy lawyer. These are people who DNA evidence, hard, cold, real evidence proved they didn't commit the crime that they spent time in prison for.
Yeah, exactly. And a few little steps in the investigation in many of these cases could have prevented that person from going to prison and perhaps put the right person behind bars.
Yeah, and we've said it before, that one of the absolute travesties about these cases isn't just, and this is horrible, but isn't just the fact that somebody who is innocent of the crime spent time in prison for a crime they didn't commit. But really, there's two tragedies. It's that, and it's coupled with the fact that whoever committed the crime has been allowed to continue to live on in society unaffected and without being punished and without being, dealt with for the crime that they've committed. So it's an injustice all the way around. I think in a lot of ways, these are absolutely the worst kind of cases, which is why we talk about them. So when you brought up at the end of the last episode, that maybe there was something there with that kind of a case, it was good foreshadowing of the case we're going to talk about today. Today we are talking about Marvin Leon Grimm Jr. This case comes to us out of Virginia, just like Lolly and Julie's case, but instead we're in the capital. We're in Richmond. And there's been a very recent development in this case. In fact, on Tuesday, June 18th, 2024, the Virginia Court of Appeals issued a decision granting a petition for a writ of actual innocence in Marvin's case.
Okay, that's the good one. That's the serious, that's not the, okay, you probably shouldn't be in prison because you might not have done it. That's the, oh shit, this dude is innocent. He ain't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's worth pointing out that this was in front of the Virginia Court of Appeals, so this wasn't in front of the Supreme Court of Virginia. But I have good reason to believe that this case isn't going to be challenged. And the reason I believe that is because after the court issued its opinion, the Attorney General of Virginia released a press release that said the OAG successfully petitioned the Virginia Court of Appeals to exonerate Marvin Grimm from 1976 murder conviction based on new DNA evidence. So the Virginia Attorney General's office put out a press release essentially touting its work here, which is kind of weird to me. But I'm glad that they're at least on the right side of this thing. So it seems like with the Attorney General himself supporting Grimm's exoneration, I would imagine that this case is not going to be appealed. The decision's not going to be appealed to the Supreme Court of Virginia.
Well, that's good. And I get that the usual conflict is your Attorney General, being like the top prosecutor in the state, doesn't really want much noise around these kinds of things because it admits that other prosecuting attorneys in the state made a mistake.
Right.
And they're all sort of same team, just, same side of the courtroom at least. So they don't want to appear like they're weak on crime. They don't want to appear like they made a mistake.
You also don't want to open yourself up to liability because, if you basically admit that you put somebody in prison for 4 decades and they shouldn't have been, then in some states at least, you can open yourself up to some civil penalties or liability for, a number of crimes.
But if that's what's right, then that's what's right.
I'm with you. I'm just pointing out why sometimes I think certain systems in certain states or certain areas are maybe a bit more, how do I want to say this, hesitant to support these actual innocence claims.
And this is why the public doesn't trust anybody. Because if you were able to operate on doing the right thing, and you got an attorney general who, when they find something was incorrect, whether it was malicious or sloppy or whatever, maybe there was no harm, the technology changed. Mm-hmm. So based on technology, when this person was convicted, everybody believed he did it. But now we're shocked to find out he didn't. We got to let him out. If every attorney general approached these things with doing the right thing in mind and made these announcements and came to the public and said, look, the wrong guy's in prison, we're getting him out, he didn't do it, and they were open to do that, I think we would be a lot more trusting in when they say, no, this is the guy, this really is the guy that did it. We would believe that a lot more because we'd feel like, well, they would tell us if they got it wrong.
Yeah, the only thing worse than putting an innocent person in prison is leaving them there after you figure out that they shouldn't be there.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, and so in this case, Marvin Grimm spent 45 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit.
That's a whole lot of freaking time.
Yeah, it is. In fact, the Innocence Project website says it's more time in prison than any client exonerated by the Innocence Project. Now, if that's not bad enough, before I jump into the details, do you care to guess the crime that he was convicted of and spent time in prison for?
45 years, I assume it's murder.
Oh, yeah, it's murder, but it ain't just murder. It's all murder's bad, right? But let's talk about prison hierarchy. What do you think would be the worst type of crime for you to spend time in prison as if you're Marvin Grimm?
A child molester.
Bingo. And so he was convicted of not only murdering a 3-year-old, but a sex offense related to a 3-year-old boy who was murdered in Richmond in the 70s.
That's disgusting.
Yeah, it's honestly, this case is awful. So in case you didn't figure it out, like that's your trigger warning. Sorry. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the case and what had happened. And I've been able to dig up some newspaper articles from Richmond from the time period when all this went down. And then there's also, and I'll make sure I link it in the show notes, but the Virginia Court of Appeals, their order granting this petition for actual innocence, it's a legal document, but frankly, it's really well written. And if you're interested in diving in even more than what we talk about here, I'm sure there'll be some details in there, and I'll make sure I have it linked up in the show notes so you can read it if you'd like. But we're going to go back to November of 1975. And it was a Saturday around 1:30 when a little boy who lived in this apartment complex, and the court uses the initials CH. I've noticed in a lot of the reporting they're not using the little boy's name. In the old reporting in the newspapers, they printed his full name because I think back then they didn't quite have the same sort of standards, and just the way that they did things was a little bit different. But in an effort to sort of respect privacy for the family and just the way that sort of modern convention is, I'm going to stick with initials. And I just want to be clear, I'm not doing that for any reason other than to try to show respect to this victim and his family and what they've been through. So if you're wondering why I'm doing that, I just want to be really clear. That's the point of it. So this little 3-year-old boy, the initial CH, kind of leaves his apartment complex, and there's an area nearby. There's kind of like a wooded area right behind the apartment complex there in Richmond. And I mean, I don't know about you, but we lived in some apartment complexes. I remember playing in some areas. I don't know that we had woods, but I distinctly remember a big pile of gravel that I played in over there, that place that Gregory's owned. And, so anyway, this is pretty common stuff, I think, especially in the 70s. But so he goes into this wooded area, he's playing, and about an hour later, it seems that he's just vanished. And so his mom called the police and reported that he was missing. There was a massive search party. Apparently, there were about 250 volunteers who were searching the entire area trying to find this little boy. Eventually, the search ended on November 26th, the next day, when his body was discovered on the southern banks of the James River.
Oh, damn.
And they found him face up in shallow water. He was fully clothed, and his arms were folded across his chest. From some of the newspaper reporting I read from the time, it seemed that he was discovered by kind of an employee, a worker person for a nearby house or an estate, something like that, who was going to, my understanding, there was like a dead deer or something that had died on the property, and the owner of the property was like, hey, can you get that out of here, take it and get rid of it somewhere.
Right.
And so he had taken it down. He was going kind of down by the river and was just going to sort of discard it down there. And when he made his way down there, he saw the remains of this little boy and immediately told his employer, who called the police, and they came in and were able to kind of process the scene as best they could back in the 70s.
Wow.
So an autopsy was performed. They determined that the boy died from asphyxia. There was no indication that he had drowned or that he had suffered any physical injury. There were, oh man, you know what, Bob? I might need your help because there's a lot of medical words here, and I could suffer through them. But I'm just gonna let you kind of take over some of this stuff to the extent that you want to talk about it.
All right. So it looks like, and we're reading from. This is what the autopsy at that time determined.
According to the court, yeah. Here now, this is what they're saying that the autopsy, yeah.
That there was, there was sperm basically in his mouth and throat, even in his esophagus. And
you talk about the tox report?
Yeah, I was seeing if that next section was anything useful. It was not. It's just a continuation of the first part. But the toxicology report showed a 0.12% alcohol or ethanol, so that is like 1.5 times the current legal limit for driving in most states. Mm-hmm. So he also found...
Just so you guys know, I put Bob on the spot. I actually sprung this case on him. He hasn't had a chance to review it because I kind of want some of his hot takes, and I didn't tell him that I was going to ask him to read some of this medical stuff. But
I also found some chloroxazone.
You want to tell the fine people in listener land what that is? Because I surely don't know. It sounds like a type of laundry detergent to me.
Well, I probably mispronounced it. There's probably an emphasis somewhere different than where I put it. It usually takes me a few times to get some of those right. It's a muscle relaxer, a prescription muscle relaxer that a 3-year-old would have absolutely no business being on. Also, some Tylenol, acetaminophen.
So if I hear you correctly, you're telling me in layman's terms, according to the autopsy back then, that this 3-year-old boy has alcohol enough that he's beyond the legal limit. He's got muscle relaxers that, no kid 3 years old would be taking at least that level or even probably at all. And it sounds like there was also apparently some sort of sperm present somewhere in his...
Yeah, his mouth, his throat, and even in his esophagus. Now, the fact that there was acetaminophen and this chlorozazazone, I don't know back then if combinations existed. Like, for instance, Tylenol 3 is acetaminophen and codeine. So I don't know if this was, a combination medication and those are the two constituents of it, but it could be separate drugs. So yeah, muscle relaxer, Tylenol, lots of alcohol, and there was even 100% alcohol in his stomach. So this had been the alcohol at least was either a recent or an ongoing ingestion.
Okay. So basically what I'm hearing is this is pretty freaking terrible.
This is awful.
Yeah. So in the weeks following the disappearance and then discovery of CH, the Richmond Police Department investigated all kinds of leads, but they weren't getting anywhere with it. I saw in some of the newspaper coverage that this went on, and I think people were frustrated and outraged, and there was a lot of you can imagine, right? This is a 3-year-old. This is a horrific crime. And
somebody murders a 3-year-old, and you find out there was a disgusting sexual component to it. I think everybody in that community wants blood.
Right. Right.
Myself included.
Who doesn't? Yeah, exactly.
Find this sumbitch and bury him under the prison.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That's too good for him.
Yeah, and so one of the Richmond newspapers, one of the headlines says, "Clues lacking in boy's death, no suspects." And so I think that was kind of the trend for a bit, right? And so they're chasing down leads. People are, like Bob said, people are pissed. The police aren't really getting anywhere. But there's this guy that lives in the apartment complex, Marvin Grimm. And in one way or another, he seemed to be involved in the investigation from the beginning. So Grimm, at this point in time, he's 20 years old, and he had been in the Navy and lived with his wife in the apartment across from CH and CH's family. He first became involved in the case on the day that CH went missing, when officers responding to the phone call knocked on Grimm's door and asked where the missing child lived. When officers interviewed CH's dad on November 24th, he reported 2 arguments between himself and Grimm. So Dad and Grimm had apparently had some beef in the past. And in response, this had to do with the Grimm was running his lawnmower over children's toys left in the front yard of the apartment. And then there was another time where apparently CH was playing outside in his underwear. So CH's mother told police that she felt Grimm was odd in his actions before providing the same details as to the arguments between Grimm and CH's father. In a December 5th, 1975 letter to the FBI, Grimm is identified as a possible suspect, quote, due to previous arguments and encounters with CH's family prior to the killing, with the notation that Grimm had lived right across the hall from CH's family's apartment. I just want to pause there and see if you have any sort of initial thoughts about where this investigation is and where it's going and how things are looking for.
I mean, check it out, but the fact that this Grimm and the parents have had beef, I mean, you know how many neighbors have beef, and that doesn't mean that one molests and murders the other neighbor's 3-year-old.
I also think, in my experience of seeing horrible people doing horrible things to children from the line of work that I'm in, it's almost always people who, it's not going to be somebody who's going to run over his toys with a lawnmower.
Right.
It's going to be somebody who's giving him toys or helping him, pick up his toys, or it's the guy that you think, oh, that's nice. He's so, little Joey really likes him, or, whatever.
Right. This guy seems more irritated by the child, and that's not usually, like, their theory is that
there's a beef with Dad, so he goes and does this to his kid.
Yeah, he didn't like what this kid was doing, but it doesn't make sense because the guy is clearly taking it up with the parents.
Right. So fast forward to December 16th, because we're fast forwarding, not rewinding. December 16th, 1975. So Grimm gets done working a 9-hour shift at work. I think it was some kind of like manufacturing, maybe like a factory, or it was like he did real work. I can't remember exactly what it was, but he like worked a job where you don't just sit at a desk and do nothing. Which, I mean, that's kind of like what I do, so I'm not hating on people who do that. I'm just saying he actually worked for a living. And he was picked up by police just before 5 p.m. and brought in for questioning. And he was questioned until about 9 p.m. when he made a statement about blacking out and having seen CH around 3 o'clock the day he disappeared. At that point, Grimm was considered a suspect. He was read his Miranda rights, and police started questioning him about his background, his family life, and all that kind of stuff. Around 11 p.m., now remember, he worked a 9-hour shift, got picked up right before 5 by the police, taken to the police station, and now we're at 11 o'clock at night. Grimm supposedly told the police, quote, what happened, and guided officers as they retraced the steps of CH's abduction, murder, and disposal. Grimm and the officers went back to the interview room at around 2:20 in the morning, and this is now after about 9 hours of questioning and 18 hours since Grimm started his workday. And this is when officers recorded Grimm's statement for the first time. Got any thoughts about that?
I don't remember the exact numbers, but I do remember finding research at one point that once you get to like 17 hours without sleep, your cognition, your functioning level is similar to that of someone that is under the influence of alcohol.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I'll also say that, if this is all coming off this confession and they didn't find some evidence, than, horse shit. Because, you got this guy who's been, hours and hours and hours in here with these detectives who probably have been trained in the read technique and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And so they're applying the pressure in all the different places and using all the tactics. They're totally allowed to lie to him as much as they want. He's brand new to this. He's 20. He's practically a kid himself, and he's getting pushed by this authority figure. And in 1975, there was not nearly as much animosity toward the police as there is in 2024. So they were definitely seen as an authority. And I don't know, I've seen plenty of situations where people, you say, I would never say I did something I didn't do, especially something as horrible as killing a kid. But, you don't know what you do when you've been...
Yeah, the psychological research contradicts that.
Right. You've been awake for 18 hours. You've been grilled, by police using these techniques for however many hours. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. People have, and it's been proven without a doubt, confess to horrible things.
Yeah, there's a lot of research that people will basically say what they think somebody wants to hear just to say what they think somebody wants to hear.
Yes, and remember that we also have the research on how memory works.
Right. Well, okay, relax.
No? Okay.
Well, I think I want to...
Are we going to talk about that in a bit?
I'm trying to remember if that's something I want to talk about in this case. But go ahead, just touch on it. That's fine.
Well, it's not like a videotape where we just play back and know this is what happened. There's been plenty of research that has been done that has proven that we can plant memories. Someone else can plant a memory in your head very subtly and maybe not even intentionally.
Right.
But if the police are sitting there telling him over and over again their theory of what happened, especially in a lowered state of cognition, he could start to...
So if the exchange went something like this, officer, what do you mean you forced sexual assault on him? I made officer again. Did you make him place your privates in his mouth? Is that how it happened? Yes. So you think maybe that might be like is that kind of what you're talking about?
That could be. I don't want to say that everybody confesses to this nasty shit is innocent.
Well, no, obviously.
There are bags of shit that, good for them, they confessed, at Chad Dorman killing his 3 little boys.
Right.
Rotten hell, you bag of shit. But just because someone confesses to something...
You got to have evidence to back it up.
Or what you're saying here is that the specifics were given to the suspect by the police, not the other way around.
Right. That's what I was getting at with this. This is kind of a foreshadowing of how the questioning that's recorded, and remember, we don't get any recorded questioning and statements until, 18 hours into this thing.
And that's ridiculous in itself. But what can happen there, the police repeat that and accuse him of that enough that it starts to implant a memory in his head that he now at that moment might be thinking, oh shit, I did this.
Right, which you think is crazy until you see the research and the studies on this stuff. And to that point, so the Innocence Project, back when the last time I could find statistics for this, and they have a lot more DNA exonerations now, I think, but when they had 250 DNA exonerations, 25% of those involved a false confession. So just to be clear, in 258 cases where DNA proved conclusively the person who was in prison didn't do the crime, they confessed to committing the crime that they were proved not to have done.
Yeah, a fourth of them.
Right.
Now, keep in mind, statistics can say anything you want, and we're not trying to say that 25% of the people that are in prison have falsely confessed to their crimes. It's 25% of those where DNA has proven their innocence.
That the Innocence Project have done. But the reality is, you extrapolate those numbers and you say, confessions need to be viewed with a little bit of a skeptical lens. And to me, it's just looking at the whole evidence. If the evidence doesn't support the confession, then there's a problem.
Right. And it's also the confession itself. If someone walks into the police station and from pretty much the moment they walk in, you have the body cam, and we've seen this, you have the body cam of them walking up to the door and saying to the officer, I need to speak to someone. I've committed a crime.
Right.
And then you follow that footage in through Miranda warning and, okay, what is it that you want to tell us? And they say, well, if you go to this address, you'll find this body. I killed this person. Here's what happened. Yeah. Blah, blah, blah.
Well, and then you go and everything lines up, right?
Yeah,
and that's how they said it.
That's probably a legit confession.
Yeah.
But when you have something that's been 6, 8, 10 hours of interrogation that the first however many hours happens to be missing. You don't know how we even got to this point, what was said to that suspect. And then after denying, all of a sudden they start repeating back the details that have been given to them.
Yeah.
Might want to double check that.
Yeah, according to the Innocence Project's website, they also say that on average, people who falsely confess were interrogated about 16 hours before admitting to a crime they didn't commit. So, to your point, it's right there about that delirium stage starts to set in where now all of a sudden, yeah, sure, anything's possible. Maybe I am the Zodiac. I don't know.
There's a parallel in marriage for men, which is you can be right or you can be happy. So at some point in an argument, you get to the point where you're just like, you know what, you're right. I did leave the toilet seat up, even though you know damn well you didn't.
Wait, no, they're just right. What are you talking about?
Right. You just at that point where you're like, I know it wasn't me that did it, but she is convinced that I did it. And in order to just stop this whole argument, to make it stop, you're right. You know what? You're right. I apologize.
Better hope your wife doesn't listen to this podcast.
Oh, she knows.
That she's right.
Right.
Okay. All right. Back to this case, though. So, where do I want to start at here? So, during the recorded statement, Grimm told the police that on the morning of CH's disappearance, that Grimm woke up by what appeared to be CH and another child throwing things at cars. And then as he woke up, he decided to go to his mom's house to get some food for the weekend. And when he came back, CH and the other kid asked Grimm if any of the food in the bag was for them and where other local children were staying for the weekend. This is just weird. So then Grimm goes inside his apartment, noted that it was sometime around 12:45 and turned on a football game before blacking out. He then stated that he, quote, left the house, went down and picked up CH way down at a little laundromat, end quote. Once he got him in the car, Grimm recalled that CH asked to be taken to 7-Eleven, but instead Grimm took him behind a nearby motel and, quote, forced sexual assault on him, end quote. The officer recording the statement then asked for clarification. That resulted in that exchange that I told you about where he says, what do you mean by that? And Grimm kind of is like, and then the officer says, do you mean that you did this? And gives the, did you put your nasty stuff in whatever? And so he's like, oh yeah, that's what I meant. The officers then asked Grimm what he used in reference to make CH do this. So that's their question. And Grimm replied, quote, the carpet cushioning knife I use at work, before explaining that he did not actually pull the knife out. He just tapped on it and said, quote, if you don't, you may have a taste of that, in reference to the knife. And Grimm then explained that he grabbed... Okay, I'm not reading that. Anyway, so he goes into some details about how he, the sex stuff, and I'll let you just figure that out.
I don't want to hear any of that, but I'm bothered back on got a 3-year-old and tapping a knife and using a statement like, you might get a taste of this. A 3-year-old. You have to be very direct with 3-year-olds.
A lot of this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so then, okay, I gotta... So, all right, I gotta share some of this. And it's if you're grossed out and this is horrible, so I'm sorry, just fast forward 30 seconds. I'll try to make it quick. Essentially, the officer then had him clarify because he had said that he... ejaculated in the boy's mouth and that the boy started choking and coughing. And so the officer asked him to clarify that, and he said yes. And he started choking and coughing, and it looked like he passed out in the seat. And I thought he was, I at first didn't know what was going on. Unsure of his condition, Grimm reported that, and then I'm going to quote him here. He says, didn't think nothing was wrong with him at this time, so he proceeded to the 7-Eleven on Buford Road. As he was passing by State Police Headquarters Turn Road, tried to wake CH up, really panicked worse, slowed down, got ready to pull in, saw a bunch of cars, and decided he better keep going. Proceeded to go down Buford Road and all these different roads, where he dumped the body in the river, took off, came and took another way out to come up on Forest Hill Avenue, and then proceeded home. So essentially, he says this sexual incident occurred, and then the boy... choked and died. He freaked out, and instead of going to the police like he thought about, he decided to just go dump his body down by the river. He says he then went back to his apartment and continued watching TV. And when a neighbor informed him that CH was missing, he joined the search for CH. Finally, the officers confirmed several details about the route that Grimm led them on earlier in the interview, prior to the recorded portion, before asking him to confirm details of how he disposed of the body. So Grimm told them that he, quote, stopped the car in a little inlet by the river, got out, covered CH up with a pea coat to make it look like a maimed animal or something he was getting rid of. He can't exactly tell if he went down to the river or threw CH from the top of the cliff there. When he did that, he whipped the pea coat back and he ran and jumped back in the car, took off. So now this part's really important because it seems like he has no idea how he got rid of the body, first of all. And second of all, we got this pea coat that he was going to put on him and had on him and had him in and then kept it back. And you might be wondering why that matters. That's going to matter here in a minute. So the officers went on to ask Grimm if he slipped on the embankment, which he said, yeah, I did. And then he explained that he also tore his shoe and his socks got wet as a result. And that exchange went like this. The officer said, here, I tell you what, you can be Grimm, I'll be the cop. Did you tell us you almost slipped on
I slipped.
the embankment?
Almost slipped on the embankment or some hard surface. I remember that.
Okay.
Because I tore my shoe open.
Yeah, so that's how this exchange went. And it's worth noting, this recorded confession makes absolutely no reference to any alcohol or drugs that were found in CH's system from the toxicology report. It also didn't provide any geographic information to the police that wasn't already blasted all over local media and that everybody knew about, because there had been this extensive reporting and discussion on where the body was found. Now, we fast forward a little bit further, we get to March of 76, and because of this confession, the Commonwealth of Virginia agreed not to seek the death penalty in the case. So Grimm pleaded guilty to murder, sodomy by force, and abduction with the intent to defile. What's interesting about this, though, is this there was this bargaining chip of we won't seek the death penalty if you plead and confess to this stuff, but guess what?
What?
He was not death penalty eligible. The crimes he had committed weren't actually eligible for the death penalty.
Oh, wow.
At that time. So the court accepted his guilty pleas based on the factual evidence that had been put in front of it, and that was that. And then he received, I think it was a life sentence. I think he got a couple life sentences or a life sentence, and they added 10 years for the sodomy charge. I remember reading that. Okay. So in order for this to go forward and then, for the sentencing, there had to be a factual basis, right? So the factual basis that was presented to the trial court back in 76 against Grimm was testimony from law enforcement personnel who got the confession itself, and then there was also forensic evidence that was submitted to the state laboratory and analyzed by a forensic scientist named Mary Jane Burton.
Oh, she's trouble.
You are absolutely correct. What made you think that? Do you know her? You and Mary Jane go back?
No, and I plead the 420 on that. The 5th on that. No, she's been tangled up in some shit in Virginia.
Yeah, you're right. Okay, so cool. You have some knowledge of this. So anyway, so the evidence included Burton's lab report with results from testing several hairs found in Grimm's car on the floorboards and on a child's sock that was there, as well as a pea coat that was found in his apartment. This is why the pea coat matters.
In whose apartment?
In Grimm's apartment.
Grimm's apartment, okay.
She tested the swabs of the pharynx, epiglottis, and esophagus, nasal passage, and oral cavity that were taken during the autopsy, and a towel that was recovered from Grimm's car that had a stain indicating the presence of seminal fluid. Now, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy also testified as to the autopsy results and the presence of spermatozoa and a thick white gelatinate material in CH's mouth. According to Burton's lab reports and notes, she performed hair comparisons on all hair samples submitted and tested swabs from the autopsy and towels from Grimm's car for the presence of sperm. From these comparisons, Burton determined that the 3 hairs recovered from the front seat and floorboard were consistent with, now listen to the language, were consistent with head hair samples from CH. That the child's sock recovered from the front seat appeared to be smaller than the sock from CH, but the single hair recovered from the sock was consistent with samples from CH, and that the 4 hairs recovered from the navy peacoat found at Grimm's home were consistent with samples from CH. Finally, with regard to the hair, Burton concluded that none of the hairs found consistent with the samples of CH were in any way similar to samples from Grimm. So Burton's test of the swabs taken from the autopsy indicated the presence of spermatozoa type O. Before we get into this part of it, do you want to talk about the hair testing at all? You got any thoughts? Or you look like you're thinking.
I'm thinking that's a bunch of crap, especially at that time. That's before the world of science came out and said, this is garbage. But this is just looking at a hair, even under a microscope, and saying,
it looks like this other hair.
Yeah.
Which yeah, that has been, the NAS 2009 report. That is completely debunked. The FBI has even supported and offered and done DNA testing in cases and helped and assisted to kind of combat the testimony that they've offered in the past in cases involving microscopic hair analysis. So, this hair testimony is basically worthless. So moving on to the spermatozoa stuff, right? So the test of the swabs taken from the autopsy indicated the presence of type O spermatozoa. Now, the test of a stain on a towel recovered also indicated the possible presence of seminal fluid, but the amount present, if any, was insufficient for typing. So that's on the towel that was in Grimm's car. Lastly, Burton's lab report stated that the, quote, tests on Grimm's saliva indicate the secretions are type A.
What?
That's very interesting. So a person with type A blood produces both A and H antigens, whereas a person with type O blood only produces H antigens. So if a person is a secretor, they secrete their antigens into other bodily fluids such as semen or saliva. And then a non-secretor doesn't exhibit antigens in bodily fluids other than blood. So
yeah, I forgot all about that secretor, non-secretor business.
But so you can see we're on the pathway to a problem here, right? So after hearing this forensic evidence combined with testimony from officers who obtained Grimm's confession, the trial court accepted Grimm's guilty pleas on all 3 counts and, like I said, sentenced him to life in prison on the murder and abduction charges, plus an extra 10 years for the sodomy charge. Now, that is where Grimm was left to languish for the better part of half a century before this petition for a writ of actual innocence would come into play.
Well, can we pause for just a second and say
Sure.
that it's possible that this all could have been avoided by using 4 words. I
plead
want
the
a
fifth.
lawyer. I want a lawyer.
That could have been an interesting 4 words. I was just thinking about that. You talk about that one lawyer video on YouTube where he tells them some other advice about when they talk to the police and
Oh, yeah.
some more colorful advice. So anyway, we get to this petition for writ of actual innocence.
But that's legit, though. Like, okay, we now know, and you're going to explain to us how they figured out this guy ain't do it.
Mm-hmm.
If in 1975, 76, whatever it was, the very first time police bring him in, or he goes in, which there'd be no need to go in, but the first time they say, we want to talk to you about this, and you understand that they're questioning you, I want a lawyer. You say nothing. Keep your mouth shut. That's the other 4 words. Keep your mouth shut. Some people think, well, I have nothing to hide. I didn't do anything wrong. Mm-hmm. Well, that's all great and well until they put you in a hot box for 18 freaking hours and have you so out your mind, you don't know whether you're coming or going, and you'll say anything.
Then they give Mary Jane your pea coat and say, hey, can you find this little boy's hair on that?
Right. And then it doesn't matter that you're innocent, because you've created evidence by way of your confession to make you guilty as hell. Yeah. So I want a lawyer.
Right. So as part of his petition for actual innocence, Grimm submitted DNA analysis, updated, of the hairs, swabs, and stain on the towel recovered from his vehicle, analysis of the autopsy's toxicology report, and also some research and expert reporting regarding his confession that he alleged was coerced and just a false confession. So the court took each of these in turn, and they did a really good job, I think, of just analyzing it and explaining what all took place. So first, we're looking at the DNA recovered from the hair. So essentially, in 2011, the Department of Forensic Science in Virginia performed a DNA analysis of the 8 hairs previously attributed to CH. They used sequencing and a bunch of fancy chemistry stuff that I don't understand to analyze and compare mitochondrial DNA of the hairs previously tested in 1976. Now, remember, that was like, looking at them, not like DNA, to samples taken from CH. From this analysis, DFS concluded that DFS excluded CH as the source of the hair from the sock, 3 of the 4 hairs on the Navy peacoat, and 2 of the 3 hairs from the front seat and floorboard of Grimm's car. So virtually all of the hairs could not have been from CH.
Yeah, we can say that 7 out of 8 of those definitely didn't come from his head.
Yeah, exactly. Now, testing of one of the hairs from the front floorboard was inconclusive due to a DNA base pair difference, and one of the hairs from the peacoat did not contain sufficient mitochondrial DNA to make a meaningful comparison.
Okay, 6 out of 8.
Yeah, 6 out of 8.
Didn't come from him.
So to be clear, 6 out of 8, totally not him. 2, they weren't able with that technology in 2011 to be able to figure it out.
Yeah, we can't tell you who they came from.
Exactly. So then in 2023, the remaining 2 hairs were tested by a company called Mitotyping Technologies. They also compared the mitochondrial DNA of both the remaining hairs with a sample from CH, and from that analysis, they were able in 2023 to exclude CH as the source of either of the hairs, both hairs. So now all 8 hairs that Mary Jane said were, CHs or whatever.
They're consistent with CH, which a jury hears as they're his.
They're his, right. Yeah, so basically all of this hair evidence is completely it doesn't point to Grimm in any way, shape, or form, which, like you said, initially it would have. I thought you'd have something. You got nothing? That's it? I thought you'd have something to say.
I told you the hair was garbage.
Okay, that's fair.
But, it took, 36 years?
Right. So let's turn around and take a look at the autopsy swabs now. I think that's the next thing to talk about. So again, in 2002, so to be clear, like for the people that do this kind of work, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved with some of it in the past, this stuff takes forever. I mean, this guy was in prison for 45 years. And don't get me wrong, if we need to be thorough, we need to be careful, but we should be thorough and careful before we put the people in prison.
Right.
Not like after they're in prison. And then, I mean, just to be like, I'm about to talk about DNA analysis that was done in 2002. This guy didn't get let out to 2024. It's just crazy how long and how arduous this process can be at times.
That part's lawyers.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's fair. Okay. So in 2002, DFS conducted a DNA analysis of swabs taken during the autopsy. This analysis, and I'm going to quote here, are you ready? Eliminated Grimm as a possible contributor of the genetic material detected in, end quote, the swabs taken from the epiglottis, the esophagus, the oral cavity, and the non-sperm fractions of the pharynx swabs. This testing showed that the DNA contained on these swabs originated from the same source. These tests were inconclusive as to the source of the sperm fractions of the pharynx swabs and therefore could not eliminate Grimm. Now, this is in 2002. So then, 10 years later, in 2012...
So we got a bunch of stuff in this kid's mouth that came from someone else, not Grimm.
Right. But there's this one little part they can't exclude him.
And we got a spot, we can't say who it came from.
Yeah, you need to clear your throat. You okay? Mm-hmm. You choked up over there?
Yeah.
You been hanging out with Mary Jane again?
Yeah.
So in 2012, a decade later, Orchid Cellmark retested the swabs with new technology, and as well as they developed a DNA profile for CH himself. These tests found no spermatozoa or evidence of seminal fluid.
Oh, damn.
Importantly, the test also indicated that none of Grimm's DNA was in any of the samples.
So now we can rule him out on those other couple spots, right?
Well...
Of DNA? Is that what you're saying?
Wait a second. But in 2017, because we have conflicting reports from DFS, who did it in 2002, and Orchid, who did it in 2012, as to the presence of sperm in CH's mouth, another lab, Forensic Analytical Sciences, Inc., examined the swabs themselves under high-powered microscopes. Their analysis considered the amount of sperm and consequently DNA that would be anticipated to be recovered on an oral swab performed during an autopsy. And this report considers the degrading effect of bacteria in the human mouth, all this other, fancy science stuff that's well above our pay grade regarding cell breakdown, all these other things. And this report also notes that once a swab is dried and stored appropriately, even at room temperature, the cellular material is effectively preserved for perpetuity. All right, so taking all that into consideration, FAS reported the presence of the epithelial cells on the swabs and noted the absence of sperm cells. Because cellular material essentially stops degrading when swabbed, the presence of the epithelial cells indicates that if sperm cells had been present at any point, they would have also been preserved in the swabs. So based on these findings, the FAS report in 2017 concluded the observation of sperm on any of these same specimens in 1975 must be mistaken. So there was no sperm at all.
Wow. And just...
at all.
So what they're talking about there, the epithelial cells, those would be like the cells lining of the trachea, the lining of the windpipe, or the lining of the esophagus. That's what those cells would be. Well, as I understand what they're saying is, we see epithelial cells. We do not see any sperm cells. And if both were there and the sperm is gone, the epithelial would be gone too. If the epithelial cells didn't break down, then the sperm cells couldn't have just broken down.
Right. Yeah.
Which means they were never there.
Bingo.
I was just clarifying because you went through that kind of quick, and I want to make sure I got it right. And
no, it's good.
Somebody else might have, gotten lost in that little spot too.
So if we go back to 1975, and he's having it clarified what he did with this boy and in this sexual sense by the police, because they think that that's what happened based on what Mary Jane and her crew said. And now, so his confession, he says he did something that literally, there would be evidence of that somewhere, and there's not.
Right, because he's alleging that the boy choked on it.
And died. And because they found it in his mouth, so that's what the police think.
Right.
So
that is all...
hogwash.
Yeah, I was going to say horse shit, but gosh, that's fair enough.
Right, okay. But, hey, there's still evidence, because there's still more evidence. So now we got to talk about the towel, because,
All right, so the hairs don't belong to the kid. Not only is the fluid in the mouth not from Grimm, there ain't no sperms in there. We've been talking about sperms for 30 years, and guess what? They ain't no sperms. Never were.
Bingo. So in 2003, the towel recovered from Grimm's car and allegedly containing seminal fluid was sent to DFS. Remember, that's a kind of a state thing for DNA testing, and DFS concluded that there was no blood or seminal fluid observed on the towel, and that DNA testing was attempted, but there was no human DNA anywhere in the samples, and no typing results were obtained.
Wow.
So the towel that supposedly had some ejaculate material on it, nope, nothing.
Yeah, didn't.
Just probably who knows what, but not DNA. So now we got to talk about the toxicology report analysis. The 1975 autopsy had that toxicology report that you talked about, and very smartly framed that, that was what they found in 75 and what the autopsy said. In 2023, this guy, Dr. Jeffrey Brent, a board-certified medical toxicology physician with a PhD in biochemistry, in case you wondered how smart he is, reviewed the toxicology reports developed during the autopsy. And in his review, he considered the quantities of substances present in CH's system, the amount of food that was identified in his stomach, and his physical size. When all these factors were taken together, Dr. Brent concluded it was more probable than not that CH ingested the alcohol, that drug, and the acetaminophen within 90 to 150 minutes of his death. Dr. Brent further noted that based on the significant difference in the concentrations of alcohol in the blood, organ fluids, and bile compared to the quantity found in the gastric contents, the system pre-mortem. And while he does recognize that it would be physically possible for CH's body to have reached those concentrations within 45 minutes, it's unlikely here based on the amount of food found in CH's stomach. Why does this 45-minute thing matter?
It's going to tie into an alibi somewhere.
Bingo. Grimm was at his apartment at 2:45 when police knocked on his door asking where the family of the missing child was. So there's no question. The cops, they're the ones who found him there at 2:45 and noted the time. Based on the time that CH went missing, this would require the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of CH to have occurred within a 75-minute window. So this whole thing would have had to happen in 75 minutes. So it just, kind of puts it there. That's where this timing stuff comes down and it matters. So in reviewing the doctor's opinion, the Commonwealth consulted a DFS forensic toxicologist because, they got to talk to their own experts. They don't trust anybody. Makes sense. DFS toxicologist stated that the ethanol concentrations could have occurred between 60 and 120 minutes and potentially in as few as 30 to 45. But the Commonwealth of Virginia noted that this slightly contradicts Dr. Brent, but doesn't refute his own report. So basically, the Commonwealth conceded that Dr. Brent's opinion likely makes the proposed timeline from Grimm's confession an impossibility. Because remember, he told the police how he did, what he did, where he went, when he went, the football game, and then, coming home with groceries or whatever, and the boys, and then taking him out, and all that stuff.
Right.
So again, the confession doesn't work.
They time that all out to he's standing inside his apartment at 2:45, and
and the cops know he's there. Exactly. So there was also a report about the false confession stuff. We've talked about that a lot, so I don't want to drill down that too much. And I think we've explained here already, the problems with the confession in this case. So that kind of gives you the background. Just before we jump into sort of, you got any thoughts? How you feeling?
To me, confessions and eyewitness testimony are about the least convincing thing in any trial.
Yeah, I mean, eyewitness testimonies is pretty terrible.
Right, that's all a confession is first-person eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, that's a good point. So having considered all of this new evidence that Grimm was able to put before the court determined that no rational trier of fact would have convicted Grimm of these offenses. So they explain how all this new evidence just completely negates everything that the state of Virginia, or the Commonwealth, had relied upon to establish his guilt in 1976. The only evidence that they had left that they could even point to was his confession. But again, like we just said, I mean, that's basically garbage, and it's just not reliable. It's clearly undercut by all of the other evidence in the case. So the court said, considering the physical evidence first, the route, the peacoat, and shoe do not indicate Grimm committed murder, abduction, or sodomy. And there's no independent source of evidence that confirms Grimm drove the route that he said he did. Possessing a peacoat is not indicative of any crime. There's no witness to confirm Grimm tore his shoe disposing of the body, and the possession of a torn shoe is no indication of a crime. When taken together, this evidence is just as consistent with non-commission of the offense as with its commission.
Right. If you imagine, and I don't like eyewitness testimony, but if you had somebody that was sitting in a tree stand down at the river that said, I saw this guy slip down the hill, and then he was cussing because he had torn his shoe on the way back up. Okay, and it was a red shoe with white polka dots, and then and it was torn straight up the middle by where the tongue of the laces are, and then that's what you find in Grimm's house. I'm listening.
Yeah.
But you got Grimm telling you he tore his shoe, and then you find a torn shoe in his apartment. Okay.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy. Well, and again, the circumstances of his alleged confession make it to where it's like, the police are the ones who are like, oh, and you tore your shoe when you were doing that, right? And it's like, oh, yeah, I tore my shoe.
And we have no idea what happened in that interrogation for, 6 hours?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time.
Before they turned the tape deck on?
After he worked his 9-hour day.
Right, because I guarantee you there wasn't no video back then.
Right.
This was,
My man just wanted to go home, eat a big piece of chicken, and go to bed.
Right.
And instead, he done got kidnapped by the police and had his arm twisted into saying he did this nasty stuff. I want to read the last part of this, and then we can sort of share our closing thoughts and quit talking about this awful case. So the court, in concluding its decision, issuing this this writ of actual innocence, said, notwithstanding the context and circumstances of the confession, Grimm's confession does not contain accurate information concerning the timeline of these crimes or the mechanism of death. Further, it omits any reference to the drugs and alcohol contained in CH's system. Accordingly, no evidence remains upon which a rational trier of fact could find proof of Grimm's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For these reasons, the court finds that Grimm is entitled to a writ of actual innocence. And then finally it says, in 1976, limited by forensic technology, the trial court accepted Grimm's guilty pleas and convicted him of the abduction, sexual assault, and murder of CH. Since that time, Grimm has recanted his confession and presented newly discovered evidence of his innocence for this court's consideration. Based on careful review of the record and newly discovered biological and non-biological evidence, this court grants Grimm's petition and issues a writ of actual innocence vacating the challenge convictions. If there is no appeal from this judgment to the Supreme Court of Virginia, the clerk shall forward a copy of this writ to the Circuit Court of the City of Richmond, where an order of expungement shall be entered immediately regarding the offenses at issue here.
Expungements, that's good. So that's it. It never happened. Clear that off his record.
Yeah.
We can't clear off the fact that, he went down for this when he was 20, because that's, when he first started being interrogated.
Mm-hmm.
And then spent 45. So, he spent whatever time in the legal process and then 45 years in prison.
What do you think it's like to spend 45 years in prison, having been the guy who confessed to and was convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering a 3-year-old boy?
A 3-year-old. I can't even imagine. This guy, like, from 20, put your life on pause at 20, and then 45 years. I can't imagine. So really, everything he knows about the world, he learned in prison. That's a scary thought. What have we done to that guy? And the family of this poor little 3-year-old, they thought they got justice. They didn't.
Right.
Whoever the real creep is, I assume he's still out there, right?
Well, and let's remember, okay, this whole sperm in the mouth thing, that's not even real.
Right, but somehow this kid ended up dead.
Oh, I'm with you. But okay, now look at the evidence that we know. We know that he had this alcohol and these drugs. So to me, it's like, that's the issue. And then it makes you wonder, was this a horrible accident gone wrong? Was this, what's the motive there? What prompted this? And I'm with you, right? At the end of the day, I don't know who did it. I don't know whatever. So for me, it's all about the kid.
Right. And the absence of sperm in the mouth does not necessarily mean there wasn't a sexual assault. I mean, there was some talk about some fluid, and I guess they finally determined, we think that white stuff we found was phlegm. But,
right.
We don't know. I mean...
Yeah, phlegm, like stuff that people have in their throats, not sperm.
Right.
Which I guess your friend Mary Jane was... maybe that'd be an interesting thing for us to talk about at some point.
Yeah, she was doing all kinds of sketchy shit in the lab and shouldn't have been... Yeah. So, bad actors here, Mary Jane was either lazy as hell or a bad actor. The part that I can pin on the investigators is... And maybe they didn't know better in 1975, but pushing for that confession. I know it still happens today, and it's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I think we're a little better today about we turn the cameras on when the questioning starts, so at least the jury can see how that confession came about, and then, of course, the defense has to educate the jury on a whole bunch of stuff. But where the detectives, I can't blame them for the lack of technology then. DNA wasn't a thing, mm-hmm. And the belief from the scientific community was we can look at two hairs under a microscope and we can tell they either, might be from the same head or probably aren't, and we can have a pretty strong we can wink to the jury that these are consistent with his. Mm. You can't, that's just a matter of, hindsight's 2020. Nobody could have known that in 1975. But the problems are the poor kid at 20, Mr. Grimm, who didn't know enough to say, I ain't saying shit.
Yeah, by the way, here he is. I meant to show you this picture. This is him being taken to city jail after the court hearing in December of 75. So that's him there.
Oh, wow. And now
this is him now with his sisters right after he got out.
Now he's an old man.
Yeah, well, he's got to be about 65?
At least.
Yeah, and spent his entire life, basically, from 20 to 65 in prison. It is crazy. It says in the Innocence Project right up on this, they talk about how he began kind of pursuing his post-conviction stuff in 1980. So he's been working his case since 80 to try to prove that he didn't do what...
Yeah, it probably didn't take him long into this to figure out, holy crap, I got conned into confessing, mm-hmm. and how do I undo this? And I imagine it seemed insurmountable.
For sure.
For him. And like you said, some of that evidence came back in 2002. And then did you tell us he was paroled in 2020, but still as a convict?
Right. So yeah, I didn't share that, but I'm glad you brought it up. So yeah, he did get parole in 2020. My guess is, I wonder if some of that was based on the fact that they could see that, oh crap, maybe this evidence isn't as good as we thought it was, so let's let him out, or if it was just a generic, well, he's been in for a long time, so we're going to parole him. But yeah, he was paroled. But even though he got out on parole, he had to register as a sex offender. So, which, you know, if he did it, that's great. That's what that's there for. But clearly he didn't do it. So
there really isn't evidence that there was a sex offense.
Exactly. By anybody.
Much less that he was involved in it.
Right. So, you know, I have thoughts and theories. I don't want to get into them on like with the little bit we know about this case. But I just think if you have a 3-year-old who has ingested alcohol and muscle relaxers, to me, based on the evidence in this case from the newspaper clippings and from the court opinions, I'm just going to guess that the suspect pool is pretty small based on that.
You think it might have been across the hall from Mr. Grimm?
I don't know. I wasn't there, but I just got to wonder when, you know.
I'm saying there is either horrible gross neglect going on here or like an actual malicious homicide or both.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it has to be somebody that has like access.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that's what I'm left with based on where he went missing from. He goes missing from home or the woods behind his home, and it appears there's no blunt trauma. There's no, according to the autopsy and stuff. I mean, it sounds like the only evidence they thought that was weird, other than the toxicology report, was that the phlegm they found in the back of his throat. But there was, my understanding, there was no, you know, trauma.
Right.
So you have this alcohol and you know, maybe it's like you said, gross neglect. Maybe it's a horrible accident, and then sort of the what do we do now? And I'm not suggesting any specific person did it. I just feel like when you're dealing with a 3-year-old who's not, you know, away at camp or lost somewhere in the city, but is, you know, somewhere close to home, somebody in that kid's orbit has to know what happened.
Yeah, and you could say, well, the kid accidentally took these pills that made him, you know, sleepy, and then this happened.
And then decided to wash it down with some vodka.
There's where you get me.
Right. The combination of the two is, to me, what takes it away from being just like a freak accident.
Poisoning, an accidental ingestion.
He doesn't know any better, and he got the Tylenol out of the cabinet. Okay, well, do you keep the Tylenol right next to the
right.
Jim Beam? Like
that's where you lose me on this kid was just poorly supervised or something like that.
And I'm not saying...
It sounds like that was Grimm's beef all along, is that this kid's poorly supervised.
Right. And then when the cops interview the parents, they're both like, oh, it's the guy across the hall.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting that any specific person did this.
No,
I have no idea.
Same here. I don't have a clue.
But it does seem to me, given just, you know, 3-year-olds can't hop in the car and go drive it a half hour away. Like, it's got to be somebody who was in that kid's orbit.
Right.
Or even if it was just somebody that lived, you know, really close by that had access to him.
Right. We don't know who else was in this kid's world, whether there was a babysitter, a cousin,
Doesn't strike me as you know, somebody's not driving along, sees a 3-year-old, says, hey, hop in my car, I'm going to give you muscle relaxers and alcohol, and then dump you at the river.
Yeah.
That seems unlikely. Possible, but unlikely to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, since the kid was kind of playing here and there and whatever, maybe it was some kind of stranger danger, but I tend to think like you, is probably someone that, maybe not a family member necessarily, but someone that this kid had seen before.
Yeah, had access to him. Yeah. Well, let us know what you think about the case and about CH. And at the end of the day, I mean, that's the thing. There are 2 victims in this case. CH, whose case now is unsolved, and that's a tragedy. And Marvin Grimm, I mean, my gosh.
Gets out of prison in his late 60s. He'd been there since he was 20 years old. So my man can't even get Social Security because he don't have enough work credits. What the heck, man?
Yeah, and I can't imagine what he's been through as a convicted child murderer and sex offender in prison. I'm sure it has not been an easy go of it for him.
I wouldn't want to get on his bad side, because I feel like if I'm him, I've been in prison for 45 freaking years for something I ain't do. I'm close to 70 or whatever he is. I would think he's pretty close to 70. I ain't got a lot of time left.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah, you're probably not wrong. I don't know.
But then again, he's probably the most kind, gentle. Right. He probably appreciates life and freedom more than any of us.
Yeah, that's amen to that.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us on the Brothers in Crime podcast. Feedback and suggestions are always welcome. For links and resources related to this episode, please see the show notes or visit us at brothersincrimepodcast.com. We hope you'll save, subscribe, or bookmark us on your favorite podcast site and join us for the next episode.